Hello, so welcome to this fifth talk in the series on 5 principles of the middle way and threefold practice. And so this is the second talk and discussion about provisionality. So just before we get going, I'll just mention a little bit about the context. So this is in a series of Zoom talks and discussions, which may then be cascaded to other groups which may use video recordings to discuss it. It's all part of the Middle Way Society, Middle Way Network. So if you want to join in, you can always go to the Middle Way Society site, middlewaysociety.net, and join the network. There are also retreats at Tiverland House, where I'm sitting at the moment, which connect with the with this series of discussions, and it's also based on a book, The 5 Principles of Middle Way Philosophy, which is published by Equinox, and which the best way of getting hold of that is on the Equinox website. So just search Equinox Publishers. Okay, so I'm going to get straight in now then. So the overall title of the talk I'm going to give first of all is Provisionality 2, Weighing Up Our Judgments. Okay, so so far, just to quickly recap the series so far, so we started with general discussion of the middle way and why it's needed due to absolutization, which is the tendency we have to get stuck because we think we have the whole story. And the middle way is a way of navigating, avoiding polarized extremes of absolutes that we get stuck in. So the 5 principles are interdependent aspects of what the middle way involves, according to the process of thought and research and so on I've been working on for the last 20 years or so, which builds on Buddhism, psychology, philosophy, various other systems, embodiment, various other sorts of sources. Okay, so the 5 principles, I started in the second talk and third talk talking about skepticism. So skepticism is recognizing uncertainty. It's not a negative position. That was the big message of those 2 talks. And then the previous talk, I started talking about provisionality. So provisionality is positively making judgments with flexibility, taking that basic uncertainty into account. So given that we're human, we're finite, we're limited in our capacities, our abilities to know what's going on, how do we live with that? How do we adapt to that? Well, we have to adjust our judgment making to make it provisional, so that we can flexibly adapt to what's going on. Okay, so I introduced the idea of provisionality last time, and then the remaining 3 principles in the rest of this series will be incrementality, thinking of things as a matter of degree, agnosticism, which is avoiding binary absolutization, and integration, so overcoming conflict through practice. So coming back to provisionality then, which is the focus of this talk. So previously in the first talk, I mentioned how provisionality is adaptive. It helps us tune into the actual conditions we find ourselves in, wherever that is. And we do that getting out of any rigid shells we might have got stuck in by considering wider options. So not just being stuck in considering the truth as we see it and every alternative as a falsehood, but instead looking at third and further options. So it's what's available to us imaginatively, particularly, that makes the difference if we can allow ourselves to consider, to be aware of alternatives. It's the way to avoid getting stuck. So I talked about optionality, that is considering further options, not just getting stuck in two options. I also talked about adaptivity, how that helps us adapt to conditions. And I also talked about the basics of how to actually be provisional in our judgments. And I talked about the 3 S's in that connection. So suppression, slowness, and synthesis. So just quickly recap those. So suppression, which needs to be distinguished from repression. So it's not repression, but it's allowing us to focus our attention on wider options, not being distracted by anything else at that point. Yes, so we do need some to be able to focus our concentration in some ways, to focus our attention in order to be provisional, which means for the moment, we need to leave things aside if they're getting in the way. But that doesn't mean we have to leave them forever or repress them. So we don't have to try and eliminate the other things that are crowding in. We just have to let go of them for the moment. So suppression, slowness. So in order to be provisional, we also need to slow down whenever the circumstances permit, which they don't always, but to use the time that's available and take the time that's necessary to consider the wider options whenever possible. And then the third, synthesis, is where the imagination comes in, giving us the imaginative capacity. If we make connections, enough connections between different areas, perhaps that we're used to thinking of separately, like separate places, separate people, separate disciplines, whatever it is, if we can synthesize, that makes it easier for us to consider wider new options and be more provisional. Which is why over-specialization can be a major problem. Okay, so that's where we got to so far on provisionality. But that left us last time with some other questions, which I left for this time. So how do we actually make decisions and judgments provisionally, especially in more complex issues, particularly what you might call intellectual judgments? For example, ones about politics, religion, philosophy, those particular sorts of complex areas, maybe complex scientific judgments, anything that academics deal with has got a certain complexity to it. How do we actually be provisional when we encounter these things? Now, there's an immediate answer to that, which I've kind of already given, which is our ongoing practice of the 3 S's. So, if we can focus our attention, if we can slow down sufficiently, if we can bring in links with new alternatives to consider new options, then we should manage to be more provisional. Those are the sort of basic conditions required to do that, I think. But we can sometimes do all those things and still make major mistakes. So, and that's often due to the complexity of the issues we're trying to deal with. And well, all systems in the world are complex, really. So we're quite likely to stumble against complex issues a lot of the time. So if we make kind of oversimplifying assumptions about complex issues, maybe assumptions that we've got from the past or from someone else or somewhere else, then suppression, slowness, and synthesis is not necessarily enough to avoid making major mistakes. And that's also because absolutization can take all kinds of intellectualized forms, and it can become entrenched in traditions, as in the absolutized beliefs in religious traditions, for example, which then encourage people down the line to continue with absolutized ways of thinking. Yeah, that with those kinds of issues, we need another approach. So what I'm going to suggest in this talk is two things particularly. So probabilizing and weighing up. So in order to make more complex judgments, we need a deliberate weighing up process. Now, so by weighing up, we're considering different options. Could be this, could be that, could be the other. Rather than what you might call, by contrast, jumping to conclusions. Yeah, so we're thinking, oh, that looks right, let's select that one. It's another way of slowing down, you could say, but a particular sort of calculated way of working with different options, weighing them up. In the process, you need to work out how weighty each option is. So that's where you get into critical thinking and a certain amount of complexity. And then, but then there's also, well, okay, so how do we get to judge how weighty each option is? That's where probabilizing comes in. So we need to be able to maximize our use of experiential information. Obviously, when we weigh things up, we could get information from all sorts of places, from our own experience, from a book, from what someone told us on the internet, whatever it is. And we need to get some idea, well, how likely are these sources of information to be correct? So there's always issues of credibility of sources involved. And then beyond that, of course, if they're telling us about a certain kind of event will happen or has happened even, how likely is that to be correct? So what's the probability that the planet will become uninhabitable by 2100, for example? So take one claim about global warming. So that's an issue for probabilizing. So before you reach a conclusion about that, you'll need to examine the evidence and think, well, how likely is this? And if somebody tells you something about it, you have to ask, well, how likely are they to be correct given what that source is like, as well as according to what they tell us? So probabilizing is a prior process before we get to the weighing up. So obviously we can't do probabilizing and weighing up for lots of everyday decisions. We just haven't got time. But it's really worth spending the time thinking carefully about those two processes, I think, when we're dealing with more complex things. So I'm going to start with probabilizing, and then weighing up is kind of putting it together a bit. Okay, so it's a common feature of absolutization, that we immediately jump to an idea of truth or reality or even falsehood to justify our beliefs. And when we do that, we don't sufficiently consider the information available to us. But because we don't have access to reality in that way, as I was saying in the talks about skepticism, that doesn't mean we can't justify our beliefs. But the justification consists of, well, firstly, obviously, making use of empirical or experiential information, but also, maybe less obviously, adjusting away from recognizable sources of delusion. So when we can become aware of biases, for example, ways we might make mistakes, we can identify mistakes we might make, absolutizations we might fall into, then that can also help us to justify our judgments. We can say, well, that's less likely to be true because of what I know about the bias of the person saying it, for instance. That's not a total solution to whether it's true or not. We can just say it's slightly less likely to be true. Okay, so this working out a probability, well, this is going to be very familiar to anybody trained in science or mathematics, because it's well established in scientific practice, the idea of probability. However, in my experience, scientists usually talk about probability rather than the process of probabilizing. So that's why I've kind of switched, or want to switch the emphasis a bit from the actual kind of figures we come up with and the relationship between those figures and data, which is what scientists typically focus on in my experience, and the process we all might go through, which is kind of parallel to what best practice in science might consist in, but it's more universal, more applicable in everyday experience. I mean, what's helpful, if you think about what scientists do when they establish probabilities, most basically they have to slow down, they have to not jump to conclusions, and they have to think conditionally about a range of possibilities. Yeah, so if a meteorologist is trying to work out a weather forecast for tomorrow and work out the possibility of rain in a particular place, or probability of rain in a particular place, then they have to think, well, it might rain, it might not, and then they might have to think about all the different possible causes of rain, you know, this movement of this high pressure and this low pressure, or whatever other things they consider technically in their calculations about it. So they have to think about a whole range of possibilities and how likely each of those are. So obviously they can't just come to conclusions. They can't say, oh, well, I feel it's going to rain tomorrow, so it's going to rain tomorrow. They have to go through that process. So that's what I'm suggesting. If we probabilize, we need to go through a process something like that. Not at all necessarily with all those technical aspects to it. We can't all become scientists, but we can follow a parallel kind of process, if you like. So yeah, I mean, obviously, in most cases of judgment, we don't and couldn't possibly have any precise data, and it might not even be appropriate even if we did. Yeah, so supposing you're trying to work out the chance that somebody's lying about why they're late, right? I mean, I suppose if you really pushed it, you could maybe get some neuroscientific data about the chances that they're lying, but that would be very difficult to arrange in the situation. So you know, you're working on experience, aren't you, and how you interpret your experience of that person. Or another everyday thing. So I've been very taken up with gardening recently, and so what are the chances if I plant this young plant? What are the chances of it being eaten by slugs? So I have to kind of weigh that up based on experience. I can't do an exhaustive scientific, you know, it would be possible in this case, I suppose, to do an exhaustive scientific survey of the amount of slug depredation in certain conditions and how they change according to the weather and the geology and all that kind of stuff. But I can't do that. It's not practical. So I have to take a guess based on my experience of when slugs eat things and when they don't. Maybe I could consult someone else who has similar experience or whatever. But in both cases, we can probabilize. That is, we can make an estimate of the probability, at least compared to other things, sufficient for us to make a judgment and maybe then take an appropriate action. So should I make the effort to put a cloth or something on top of this plant to protect it from slugs? Or put a bear trap next to it or something? Yeah, so should I bother doing that? Is it worth the energy? I have to weigh that up. So that's about comparative probability, isn't it? And also I've got to put in my values there, if you like, and what I think is worth doing. So comparative probability doesn't necessarily involve numbers at all. It's just rough estimations. Or going back to the other example of whether a person's lying or not. So given his previous record, even taking into account my biases about him, I might conclude this person is likely to be lying. So that's at least I've considered the different sides there, and I've tried to work out which is more likely. So it's just, despite the lack of precise data, it's having gone through that process rather than just jump to the conclusion that he must be lying, is still valuable. And obviously that can be connected to overgeneralized or absolutized assumptions about people. So rather than assuming, oh well, this guy's some kind of crook, he always lies, which starts to absolutize that characteristic of that person, I think about it in a context. I consider, is he lying or not lying? What's my experience? What might be his motives for lying, for instance? And try and make a more adequate judgment about it, which avoids absolutization. Okay, so those sorts of judgments are based on vague estimations. But again, precision again may be great in science, and it's required in science, but it's not always an advantage. It's sometimes false. So if people quote you a figure, you need to ask where the figure comes from and how good the evidence for that figure is. And so you have to take into account the limitations of the data collection and how it's been interpreted and so on. So figures can be a big red herring. They can be a trap in some cases if you're not handling them carefully. So in some ways, we might be better off without numbers in some everyday contexts, I think. So if we acknowledge the vagueness and focus on the practice of probabilizing, maybe that might be more effective. Obviously, not for specific scientific things where there is a possibility of precise measurement, but that's not what most things, that's not the situation in most cases. So I would say, the provisionality of the data or the information we use is more important than its precision. And of course, you could go on to apply some of the things that scientists and philosophers of science have developed about probability. The principles of Bayesianism, for example. We should adapt our estimates of probabilities as we go along. So in a way, Bayesianism has a lot of probabilizing technique involved, I think. So you could make use of some of that, but I think that's a further development. So we need to first of all focus on making sure that we're probabilizing before we necessarily jump into more specific scientific approaches. Okay, so there's two kind of specific problem areas, I think, in probabilizing. So one of them is asymptotes. I'll explain what that means in a moment. And the other is value judgments. And I think this is probably where I'm going to depart from more sort of conventional scientific thinking and offer some more startling approaches, perhaps. So the first one, asymptotes. So an asymptote is when a graph gets very close to the 100% top axis or very close to the 0 bottom axis. So it's a graph plotting some kind of process and how much of it there is. So it's basically an apparent near certainty. So as the probability hits very, very nearly 0 or very, very nearly 100%, you can call that an asymptote. So there's a 99.9999 etc. % chance that, for instance, the sun will rise tomorrow. If I don't see it, there'll be a sun behind the clouds. So there's a very high probability of that based on huge number of previous occurrences and everything we know about astronomy and the process of the Earth's rotation and so on. So that's an asymptote, but it's not an actual certainty. I would want to argue. And it's quite important not to treat asymptotes as absolutes. So it's a kind of shortcut to do so. You can see why people want to use that shortcut. They think, oh yeah, well, we know the sun will rise tomorrow. It's a fact. But that's the shortcut. We have to, if we do use our language, we need to bear in mind that it's a shortcut whenever relevant. So a part of the problem with this is that we have such difficulties with high probabilities and low probabilities. And that's reflected in research by Daniel Kahneman, a cognitive psychologist, in how we tend to treat very high probabilities and very low probabilities. So we tend to treat very high probabilities as certainties and very low probabilities as non-existent. Obviously, in the majority of cases, so in effect, we greatly overreact usually to that gap, that very small gap between the absolute certainty and the asymptote. We have great difficulty adjusting to it appropriately. So some examples of that might be in fear of flying. Yeah, so you probably will be aware that statistically planes are safer than cars, for example, on a typical journey. But some people are still afraid of flying, irrationally afraid of flying. They can't process the statistics, as it were. So there remains a danger, obviously, that the plane might crash. But yeah, that very low probability is hard to process. You know, as soon as you take it into account, as soon as you find it meaningful, you're likely to, you may then spring to absolute beliefs about it. It's going to crash. And I think maybe something similar is going on with global warming denial, say. Because there's doubt, or there are some grounds for not total certainty, even though, as far as I understand it, there's an overwhelming amount of evidence for anthropogenic global warming, that people who continue to deny it overinterpret the doubts. They've not come to terms, in effect, with the difference between a very high probability and a certainty. That effectively, when we've got a very high probability, yes, in practice, we should act as though that was the case, unless we have counter evidence, very clear counter evidence. But that doesn't mean that we should shut down our awareness of alternatives entirely. So it's important to maintain the distinction between asymptotes and absolutes, so that we have awareness of alternative options that we can call on when relevant, without allowing sort of negligible options to affect either our emotional state or our practical judgment. Yeah, so there's no point in panicking about the danger of a plane crash. That's not going to help us, and indeed, there's no point in avoiding the practical steps which are required to respond to global warming. So we shouldn't allow those negligible options, if you like, to interfere, but at the same time, we shouldn't repress those alternatives. We need to maintain those alternatives as possibilities, and possibly review them from time to time. But obviously, there are occasions when it's just not relevant to do that, and there are many occasions. There are lots of hypothetical scenarios you can easily invent where very unlikely things might be the case, and there's a very, very low chance of them being the case, but you can't totally rule these out. So let's say the chances of an aardvark hiding in my bedroom, right? So this is asymptotic. There's very, very thin chance of an aardvark hiding in my bedroom. There's no evidence at all, no positive evidence that I have an aardvark hiding in my bedroom. But in addition to that, it's just not relevant. Yes, so it's a fantasy. It's a theoretical example. It's not something that's going to make any difference to anybody, including me, other than as a theoretical example. So I don't need to spend time thinking about that and worrying about the aardvark and what I'd need to feed it on or anything like that. It's not relevant at the moment. So there's a difference, I think, between responding to possibilities when they become relevant and worrying unnecessarily about them when they're not relevant. Okay, so I think that this can have a big practical effect in how we treat probability issues. So the coming back to global warming example, yeah. So the belief that global warming is occurring and anthropogenic is very highly justified. But if you react to it being so highly justified by saying it's true or we know, then I think you then set up an absolutizing, polarized model. Yeah, so you probably set up a polarized discourse of people reacting to what they would then perceive as an absolute assertion that this is true. So one of the advantages also of maintaining that difference is just in our ability to listen to other people who maintain something else. The room for doubt shouldn't affect our practical judgment, but it might affect our communication in some cases when it becomes relevant. Okay, so that's the asymptotes issue. The other one that I mentioned is values. So how can we probabilize values? Actually, I think it's important to do so, that this is not orthodox scientific ways of thinking at all. So the in the scientific use of probabilities, they're not generally applied to values because values are regarded as subjective. But the probabilizing process, I think the underlying process, as opposed to the precise estimation of probability based on data, probabilizing process can be applied, I think, just as much to values as it can to factual claims. And in a way, that's not surprising because there's no absolute distinction between them anyway. So whenever you make a factual claim, there's going to be some values involved. And whenever you make a value claim, there's going to be some factual assumptions involved. But we can probabilize about values being correct, but I think we really need to do so in a very specific way. Yes, so we can probabilize about values much more effectively if we focus on the probability of our judgment in this particular context being correct, or somebody else's judgment in a particular context being correct, rather than on general rules or moral principles being correct. Is it right or wrong to do such and such, for instance? And the correctness, I think, there is about effectively avoiding sources of delusion in our context. Yeah, so are we going to, if we act in this particular way, if we apply these particular values, is that going to help us? Is that going to avoid sources of delusion? Yeah, so if to take an extreme example, if my values are murderous and I think it's right to murder people, then that's not going to address my sources of delusion, is it? It's going to dig me deeper and deeper into them because of all the conflicts I'm then going to set up between myself and others and within myself as well. So there's this constant interaction between these values, even though we like to separate them off abstractly. there's this constant interaction between our values and our assumptions about the world. So if we make those specific, then we can probabilize, I think, about particularly in a comparative way. Yes, so if I do X or if I do Y, am I more likely to be morally correct in my doing X or Y? And I think in practice, actually, people often do that. And they have to do it in a relatively vague way. And there's really nothing wrong with that, because that's how we do most things. But then I think also it's really helpful to consider what might be involved in ethical judgment, what justifies ethical judgment. So that's where my approach, which I can't say a lot about now, but it's stretch ethics. Yes, so the idea that ethics is a stretch. So what is good for us or what is right is a stretch from what is the case at the moment. It's a manageable move in a particular direction, which moves us to address conditions in a slightly wider way and to move away from absolutized assumptions. So if we can do that, our judgments are more likely to be correct judgments, as it were, in that context. So there's a higher probability of a moral judgment being right, I think, if it places us in that stretchy zone where we're just reaching for a slightly more adequate view of the world than if we just carry on with our sort of habitual ways of operating. And you could also see that as neither idealizing, yes, so not jumping to, oh, I should do that, but really I can't, it's impossible, you know. So, for example, if you're a meat eater, I should become vegan like tomorrow, but that's probably too much of a jump. Yeah? Or if you, there's the idealizing side, or there's the social deterministic reduction. Yeah, so we have to do what our group tells us, basically, and morals are just ways of enforcing what our group wants, which just gives us no responsibility. So the idea of stretch, I think, can really allow us to take into account both where we start, including what our group says, and where we want to get to, where we, you know, our idealizations that inspire us. So if we take into account both the justification of our factual beliefs, for example, about our capacities and the values we experience, and we take into account the need to consider new values beyond ones we experience to stretch our values, then we're beginning to apply provisionality really to moral judgments. So just to let's just apply this to a sort of hackneyed example of the moral issue. Yes, so people often ask, is abortion right or wrong? So yeah. So if you're going to apply probabilizing to this, rather than asking what's the probability of abortion being wrong, yeah, that's too big and too abstract a question. You need to instead ask, what's the probability of this woman in this particular situation with these values that she starts off with being right in her judgment to have an abortion in these circumstances, taking into account as much as she can of the values that might challenge her decision. So there's a lot to take into account there, but there's a specific situation, a specific judgment by a specific person. And that's in the third person, that's about that woman, this hypothetical woman, but even better, me, you know, what's my judgment? What's the probability that my judgment will be better, will be correct in this particular circumstance that I'm actually facing? Okay, so that's how I think we can probabilize about value judgments. We can probabilize about any judgment, effectively. So once we have probabilized sufficiently and got a as wide an idea and understanding as possible of what we're dealing with, we then have to weigh up the options. So we need to reach judgments for practical reasons, but hopefully we should do this if we have time and opportunity to do this. We need to do this by considering the probabilities of different options being correct as far as we can, or at least comparing that probability roughly. So that involves weighing up how justified each option is in comparison with the other options. Now, that's a bit different from what you might call a process of deduction to reach an answer. Yeah, so that's often how people abstractly think about judgment. You know, that we put in the data and we get the answer at the end of it, as it were. But weighing up, I think, is a slightly different process. So we've got, you know, several heaps in front of us, if you like. So if you think like a child with several piles of bricks or something, to make it a very sort of tangible metaphor of what we're doing. So which of these piles of bricks is higher than the other one? And they've all got something to be said for them. You know, they're all lovely piles of bricks. They all address conditions in different ways. But we still got to decide which is the higher pile of bricks, which we're going to go with in practice. So that process of weighing up, yeah, again, but the way most philosophers would talk about this is in terms of reason or rationality. This is the rational thing to do. I don't find that language very helpful, because it's not really a process. It's not primarily a process of reasoning. It's a process of weighing, of experiencing different weights, if you like, metaphorically speaking. So how strong is the justification in each case, and getting a sense, an overall sense, a contextualized sense of them in relation to each other. So when we've weighed up the options sufficiently, and what's sufficient obviously depends on practical time and factors, we have to reach a judgment based on which seems to be heaviest. We can only really do that if we're dealing in provisional, probabilized possible beliefs about things. Yeah. So if we have absolutized any of the options, then we can't weigh it up. So this is what constantly interferes, I think, with the process of weighing up as our best bet for making a good judgment. That absolutization tends to try and short circuit the process by saying, oh, it's just true or it's false, that it's not a matter of probability, or even trying to kind of appropriate probability to something that's always discussed in true or false way. So people claiming that there's a certain probability that God exists or doesn't exist, for example. So you know, if you're dealing with something like that that's being thought of in that way, it's usually about things existing or not existing. Then you really can't weigh it up. There's no way of comparing it. You know, it either wins hands down immediately or it doesn't. So it's cut out, it's excluded from that process of weighing up. And so that's the trouble with absolutization. So we have to leave aside absolutized options, not denying them. And that's the practice of agnosticism comes in there, which I'll say more about in future talks. If we're not sure whether we're absolutizing or not, or whether someone else is absolutizing or not, we can probabilize about that, and often we have to do that. Yeah, so somebody's, you know, we quite often we've only got somebody's language to go on, yeah, in a particular context. Yeah, so if the vicar's giving a sermon in the the pulpit and he talks about God and makes statements about God, for example, is he absolutizing? Well, probably, but you'd have to look at the whole context, sorts of things he generally says, etc. How does he view what does he mean when he's talking about God? How does it relate to his experience, and so on? So we'd have to probabilize about that in turn, in order to make a judgment about how we can avoid absolutizations in weighing up. But those things aside, absolutizations aside, the weight of an option is largely based on the strength of evidence available to us, whether that's directly or indirectly. Yeah, so obviously in a very complex world, we usually rely on indirect information. So we look things up on the internet rather than immediately encountering it in our own experience. So when the information is indirect, for example, from an expert or on the internet or whatever, so we need to also then be able to weigh up the credibility of that source against conflicting sources. When people make mistakes, I think in assessing information on the internet, it's often comes from not considering their credibility. So not thinking about, well, how likely is this to be correct given the various ways that there are weighing up that likelihood. So before I finish, I'm going to say a little bit about credibility. So this is an aspect of critical thinking, really, which I've taught in relation as an aspect of critical thinking. It's a really useful set of skills, which I think could be much more widely shared and employed. So fairly briefly, to check credibilities, to do it systematically, to think carefully about, is this source credible? If it's a newspaper, a website, whatever it is. First thing you can consider is consensus and conflict. Are there a load of sources that say the same sorts of things? If so, how good are they? Or are they conflicting with each other? So, for example, if there's a lot of different news organizations reporting the same events, then probably those events are roughly what actually happened. It becomes more and more likely that they are, rather than there being a mass conspiracy that all the news organizations are lying to you. So consensus and conflict, but then the other major thing is the Raven criteria. So Raven is a little mnemonic for 5 different credibility criteria. So reputation, ability to observe, vested interest, expertise, neutrality, and neutrality or bias. Yeah, so I'll very briefly say a little bit about each of those. So reputation, what do we know about how reliable that source is from what people generally think about how reliable it is? Yeah. So the BBC, in my opinion, generally a reputable source. So it has its moments of inaccuracy and difficulty, but generally pretty reliable, and most people who use it at least would say that it's pretty reliable. Now, ability to observe. So if somebody claims something, were they actually positioned to experience it or to get information about it? If they tell you about what happened in an accident, they weren't there, then that's obviously a limitation. Vested interest, are they trying to sell you something? Is it political propaganda, whatever, yeah? Have they got something big to gain or lose? That's obviously going to affect their credibility positively or negatively. Expertise, obviously, do they have qualifications or a track record or a profession that might lead you to take what they say more seriously when they're talking about their area of expertise? And then neutrality or bias. So what's their previous record of being very biased in their what they say? So if you try and put all those things together. Obviously, now there's a big weighing up process there, isn't there? You have to put all those things in the pot and stir them up. So if you've got a source like, say, a newspaper or a website or something that's got vested interest, but it's so that counts against it. But on the other hand, there's lots of expertise on display. It's got a good reputation. It generally appears not to be too biased. Then maybe on balance, you could, give it quite a high rate of credibility. So vested interest isn't always a big problem. People do have things to gain all these from what they say, but it doesn't mean they're wrong, although they're right. So all of these different credibility criteria, you can throw them in the pot, and they're all a matter of degree. So it takes us back to the use of provisionality and the way we assess what people say. So it's not total acceptance, total rejection. This adds to how likely this is to be correct or incorrect. And if we take one of those credibility criteria and take it to be the whole story, then we're immediately absolutizing. Yes. So if you absolutize expertise, for example, you immediately accept what the expert says just because the expert said it, and that's it. But if you weigh up expertise, then you might take it seriously because an expert said it. But on the other hand, well, maybe he didn't have access to the information he needed. Maybe he's got vested interest that makes it suspicious. Maybe he's being paid by an oil company or something. Yeah. So there's other things that might weigh against that. Okay, so that's just a quick survey of credibility. There's the information about credibility in the 5 Principles book is not in the provisionality section, but it's right at the end of the practice section. Okay, so finally, to pull this together a bit, so I've talked about weighing up and probabilizing as aspects of making complex decisions. So they can provide kind of a way of avoiding absolutizing and making the most of our available experience and available evidence. And they can do that in all kinds of judgments, in all kinds of situations, whether they're scientific, moral, personal, impersonal, whatever. And I think the idea of probabilizing learns from and incorporates scientific approaches, but it doesn't try to apply these unrealistically to individual judgment. Yeah, it's great sort of being inspired by what science does, but it does it in a particular socially organized way with lots of equipment and funding and so on, which most of us don't have. So we need ways of extracting what's helpful from that. Yeah, let's build on what's good in scientific approaches and make it effective for us individually. And we'll see also further refinements. We can continue to learn from scientific thinking in this respect and incorporate it into our approach, as I mentioned, in relation to Bayesianism, for example. But it's important to get probabilizing right in its own right, I think, first of all. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and let's see what sort of reactions or thoughts you might have about that. Any audience? How does it relate to your experience of using probability, for example?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I can really talk about in my practice of medicine and teaching medicine to medical students and stuff. So obviously there's a lot of having to make on the one hand, very important, very quick judgments, and also provisional judgments that can then be changed due to further evidence. It's kind of the crux of especially general practice. That's what you're doing every 10 minutes. And so, yeah, all this is what you've talked about is is very relevant. Occam's razor seems to be really popular, or has been very popular in medicine. I don't know what you think about that I think it's kind of not very well, put across, but it's definitely, and different people go through different stages. So they go through different stages of being able to make judgments as they're learning. I think that needs to be taken into account as well. So when I teach medical students, for instance, it's a standing joke. They go through a stage where they learn about everything, and they're unable to be able to differentiate what is more likely to be the case than not likely to be the case. So that's where the Occam's razor thing comes in, because it's always the joke that medical students hear hoof beats and think of zebras. And it's our job as educators to get them, or people with more experience, to get to a point where they hear the hoofbeats and then hear horses. Again, basically they have to kind of come around into a full circle, because they've learned about all these wild and wonderful rare diseases, and so they don't know how to kind of almost the judgment gets worse before it gets better. They have to go through a very interesting stage on how to make a diagnosis. And so, things that initially came to my mind. But yeah, I think the scientific method, for me, really did help from a very early age, kind of, the provisionality of, okay, you change your judgment based on further evidence. And that's always open. Then you never come to a final conclusion about anything, because if further evidence comes up to then you have to take that on board and revise your judgment.
Yeah, which is a great gift to the world, I think, in some ways, the scientific tradition.
Yeah, although I've met plenty of scientists who don't approach the scientific method like that. Because they have that, especially when they have their own agenda, like if they're in research and stuff, and they need to prove themselves, they need to get funding, or they need to I mean, the biggest one in medicine was obviously the immoral one that I can think of was Andrew Wakefield, who is on the surface looked to be doing great work, but used the scientific method to justify, and continues to do so, which is absolutely astonishing to me, to justify a great harm that he's done to a lot of a whole generation of people not getting vaccinations.
Yeah. So I mean, you were asking perhaps about Occam's razor.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think it's useful as an approach?
I think it's useful at that certain stage when you need to, as I said, when these students, when they get to, or juniors, when they get to a point where you need to kind of get it back to a level of like, wait a minute, you've gone off into this place of like, so that's again with the middle way. If somebody's gone too far over to not be able to make a value judgment on what's more likely or not, then you need to use principles like just go with the simplest explanation, just go with what seems to be the most obvious thing, or the most common thing almost, or is it more likely to be one diagnosis rather than two diagnoses? Yes, it usually is, you can boil it down to one overarching diagnosis. So those things can be very useful. But on the other hand, they can also, then you get further down your career. So that's the other problem. Then you get into my stage of my career, or later on, that's the main problem, because you start getting lazy with pattern recognition and thinking that you've seen this so many times before, or your brain just defaults into the most likely, the most common thing, And that's where you miss serious diagnoses.
Yeah, so obviously there's a wider point there, isn't there, about our judgments, which would apply beyond medicine as well. But what seems to me is that about using the simplest explanation is that so much depends on whether you're using this to kind of open up the options or close them down. So Occam's razor could be used to, well, it can be used obviously to make a practical judgment when you have got lots of options, presumably. But it's a way of making the options practicable, I suppose, isn't it? Because you're better able to investigate the simpler options.
But the simplicity versus complexity thing, I don't think is necessarily very useful. I tend to go more with the seriousness. That you need to focus on and be go straight to what is the most potentially serious or life-threatening thing, or thing that's the most important thing to the patient that you need to address first, and either to prove or disprove first, because the consequences of getting that wrong are the most serious. And then work from there to the least potentially serious. And to do that, you need to already have the knowledge to know what's serious and what's not.
So that sounds like a different criterion from Occam's razor.
Yeah.
I mean, I have also seen Occam's razor used to shut down options philosophically. So it can be used dismissively. This is a complex explanation, so therefore it can't be right. So it all seems to depend on the practical circumstances and how much they demand a simple explanation as the only one you can sort of act on.
And also time pressures as well. I mean, if you're in A&E or in ITU and you have to make very quick judgments, because if you don't make a judgment in a certain time frame, that could be more dangerous. If you're standing around kind of trying to debate the complexity of whatever, it may be worthwhile to go with the simplest option and just go for it and hope for the best, basically.
Any thoughts, Jim?
No, I think I started going down sidetracks. I think just thinking about things. So I certainly know you're saying about experts in, say, in the scientific field having their own sort of, not pet theories, but sort of their signature technique or whatever, and that seems, I mean, that seems like a very understandable thing, that you become, maybe you have a tool that's used to solve some specific problem and it has some success in a scientific sense, and then it becomes, it's like I said, it's your signature thing. You understand that technique really well, so you start using that. It's like you've got the hammer and the whole world looks like a nail. But that, I don't think necessarily that's a bad thing, as long as it's in a context where that can be challenged, which supposedly that's how science does work. That there are that people are held to account, that the evidence is what, like I say, there's this weighing up thing, and you need people to explore different approaches in order to make any kind of progress into areas where you don't know. But it's I mean, I've read some quite there are some things about, for example, like particle physics is very esoteric, sort of end of hard science, and it's it receives a lot of fund, taxpayers' money kind of thing, and there are people saying, well, people who understand the value of science, but is this what we're spending our money on? Is it some kind of sort of closed shop where it just sort of ends up justifying itself, and and so there's even that aspect of it, of weighing up, well, what are we going to focus either our money or time or our attention, or as the human race, what is it that we're trying do. And so how much are we willing, how much is, and I suppose in that aspect it comes down to resources, because it's people's salaries and so on. But it's that idea of, how do we, what's the current situation? What have we ended up with? What are people looking into? What are their reasons for it? And how much do we, obviously the particle physics will justify itself, and I'm familiar with the justifications that are given, but I'm never quite sure if even the people making the justifications for it, sort of 100% believe that is the actual reason that they're doing it. So that's the vested interest thing, I suppose, that it's easy enough to listen to an expert, but you think, well, that's kind of what you're paid to think about, and so it gets quite complicated.
Yeah, I mean, all that relates to the question of specialization, doesn't it, and over specialization. That's
but that's a real, that sort of area of sort of hard, the physical sciences in well, I suppose that's just the bit I know about, but yeah, it's everything is so. I think I may have already said this, but when I was doing my PhD thesis Viva, so there were these 3 people in the room, one of whom was my supervisor, and 2 were other physicists who had, well, I wouldn't like to say they'd read my thesis, because I can't imagine they had read any more than the beginning and the end of it, but they were lost by it. And kind of me and my supervisor, and perhaps some of the other students working on the same thing with my supervisor, were the only people who sort of would really know about all the nuts and bolts of what we were doing. And I was obviously generally justifying what I'd done, but it was hard for them to challenge it because it was so specialized. From that experience, I've seen just how specialized science is, that the idea of defending your thesis, it's a historical thing, going back thousands of years, the sort of that tradition of academia. But to be able to challenge someone, I don't know what you're trying to do, stop something bad slipping through the net or something like that. I guess that's the ultimate thing. So, what kind of heuristics were the people who examined me actually using, because they hadn't gone through and with a fine-tooth comb and analyzed every argument and mathematical argument I'd made and every bit of analysis and so on. They were using something that was more, experience, I guess, and that's open to abuse or ignorance or delusion as anything else, I suppose.
Right, but there was surely a relationship with a wider context.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It's just that was just astonishing to me, that I was trying to, I suppose it's hard for me because I was a student at the time, but I was thinking, if 30 years down the line, I was the person who was, brought in to be and even though I might be an expert in some respect in that field, to be able to spot, I don't know, not fraud, but to be able to spot something, was something legitimate or not in that field is really hard to do, because of the you're literally dealing with such a niche of a niche kind of thing.
But certainly, I mean, generally over specialized people who are working in an over specialized way can get into loops, can't they? They're just
I mean, that's why I think it's quite good that the stuff I was doing was theoretical, and the people, the 2 external people were experimentalists, which is good. It's good in a way, because it meant that was more of a reality check on what I was doing. Of had I just gone into sort of a mathematical loop, if you like, and sort of started, so there was that side. But on the other hand, they it was hard for them to appreciate the nuances of the different techniques that had been applied, because their angle on it was very different. But it's I mean, I felt reassured by the process, but it just highlighted that the how difficult things are when they get so specialized.
But it seems to me important to provide a context of some kind, so specialization tends to become over specialization when there's no further context. It's just feeling itself in a
and plus it wasn't explain your thesis to a 5-year-old kind of thing, but it was you had to be able to show that you had to be able to communicate with someone who wasn't just someone who was several steps removed, not just someone who was in the same closed little group that you were in. So that's,
Yeah.
I guess that's the openness side of it. That
Yeah.
and that you know that from the very start, kind of thing. So the whole culture of, I suppose it's imbued in the culture of it, isn't it? That everyone understands that that's the way this works, and everyone knows that everything is open to discussion, and that and like I said, and because it's a physical sciences, you know, if it disagrees with experiments, you need to rethink what you're doing, so that you don't just stamp your foot and say, no, I insist it's right, because that's not how the sciences work, or that's not how they'll get anywhere.
Yeah, I think that will be the case with philosophical theory as well. You know, does it apply and work in practice? But unfortunately, that criteria is not always applied.
Not applied.
Yeah.
But see, I mean, it's funny also that I'm thinking about it in this way, when actually what I have been doing for the past 20 years is teaching physics to 11 to 18-year-olds. So, which is a completely different field of practice. And I assume it's much more like engineering than it is like the sort of the physical science that I was doing previously. In that we're sort of almost, not quite, but we're not quite trial and erroring it, but we're certainly using heuristics, and we're having to be much more adaptable, and you change what you're doing, but you know, there's not always sort of theoretical reasons for why you change something that you're doing to another approach, but you kind of learn from the experience and the practice of it much more than sort of trying to be rigorous about anything.
Okay.
I just mentioned as well, like regarding, you were talking about the basis for then collecting the information for them, what you to then weigh up. I mean, this is a problem. I think this is the key issue moving forwards, because you know, that's what when I start talking about what I call the post-truth age. I mean, especially now, even you know, with AI and everything, and deepfakes and things like that. I mean, it's, you know, I'm finding it incredibly difficult with anything, even now, to kind of be able to judge online if there's any basis for this, you know, being truthful or accurate, or it's nearly impossible already, because when you've got the possibility of, you know, you can literally create fake, like I could be an AI and somebody could be just typing this in and talking, and you wouldn't know the difference. You know, that level of kind of like, you know, we're getting to the point where it will be impossible to judge that, and to judge where that information is coming from, what the agenda is there, what this is going. And at that point, it's like, I think, well, where do we end up? And I, you know, at the moment, my thinking is I just have to keep going back to basic kind of ethical and moral principles, you know, and just, you know, go from there, basically, you know. But it's, yeah, I find that concerning, and you know, I think it's going to be a real issue, especially with younger people. I already see it as well. They kind of give up before they even start trying to make any judgments, because they basically, yeah, there's this kind of passive kind of like, well, how can I? Because how can I even know what's real, what's true, what people's agendas are? I can't even know that. So
yeah, there's a lot of, I think, a lot of training and practice in critical thinking needed, basically, to be able to handle these increasingly complex issues, and a lot of the education system is not providing that sufficiently, or people don't have other sources of it sufficiently.
Yeah, I mean, I've signed up to, like, found this news channel where, which I haven't really looked into that much, but basically there's a news channel which their whole thing is they're not actually produce the news themselves. They spend the time presenting you with, you know, this, as you were saying, like these 10 outlets, which are usually previously thought to be quite reliable, are all saying a similar thing about this, and this is the kind of where that might be coming from, and this is coming from, and they do all that work for you and present it to you so that you can then start, you know, teasing that out. So, you know, people are obviously thinking about this and thinking, you know, that's we've got to kind of like build that into the system.
Yeah. And I do find there's a disturbing number of people that are happy to dismiss huge numbers and a huge number and range of news organizations reporting, you know, so it's all wrong, it's all propaganda or whatever. So it's just that immediate recourse to the absolutization that people just need a lot of context and training to be able to avoid falling into that. So it's difficult to know.
And when you can doctor information, I mean, even video, audio, when you can doctor and change the information so easily to remove all context or completely change the context, basically to fit opposite narratives.
Yeah.
You know, very quickly and easily. Like literally, where do you even go from there? It's like,
well, there are only certain kinds of outlets that are likely to do that, aren't there? You know,
but I mean, like, then these things go viral.
Yeah.
So these, you know, if they're very charged one way or the other, they'll just go viral. There won't be an outlet or a particular thing. It will just be everywhere on social media and on feeds and stuff like that. I mean, you know, and you can see you can see the same footage showing basically two completely opposing conclusions that you could come to.
Right. Well, you can even get fake news reports, can't you, that purport to come from a reputable news organization. Yeah. So, but as far as I can see, we just have to try and take that into account somehow. You know, if there's a possibility that fake BBC news reports might be circulated on Twitter or whatever, then we'll just have to go back to what the BBC actually puts out itself, rather than relying on the version that's being shared. That's cuts against a lot of people's habits, or at least follow up the links till you get back to the source.
Yeah, but I mean that can take, you know, to do that can take hours now. You know, you can just end up going down a rabbit hole where it's this and then it leads to this and then it leads to, and you can never get back to, you know, you'd have to be a professional hacker to get back to where the original source of that came from, you know.
Yeah. So in practice, you might often have to say, well, this is dubious. I don't believe this until I can get clearer, better authenticated evidence for it or something like that. Okay, we're better be winding up here, I think. But yeah, thanks for those comments. So I'll just finish with some questions for reflection. That might be a basis of discussion. So my suggestion for an approach to further discussion of this is or reflection about it is to take a specific issue that you've made a judgment about, preferably quite a complex issue. So for example, a political issue, say, and try and retrace your steps in having made it. So how did you reach your position about this issue? Say, the source of COVID or the Ukraine war or something like that. That's an important issue. So I'm going to suggest 4 questions you could ask yourself about this, which bring in probabilizing and weighing up. So firstly, did you weigh up options or did you jump to conclusions when reaching your views about this topic? So if you weighed up options, can you identify the options you weighed up? So obviously you don't just sort of reassure yourself that you weighed up options. Can you actually think through what the options were? Secondly, what range of options did you consider? So actually here, I've just mentioned that question, the effect. So first question, did you weigh up the options or jump to conclusions? Secondly, what range of options did you consider? And then thirdly, what assumptions were the factual or value assumptions did you make? So were these probabilized? Did you think of them as a matter of degree, or were they just assumed as a whole? Then fourth question. So were there any asymptotes? So were there claims that you consider practically certain, 99.999% likely, for example, were they involved in this judgment? If so, did you treat them as absolutes or as asymptotes? Can you see the difference? Okay, so it's just a possible chain of reflection to go into this a bit more deeply in relation to your own experience. Yeah, so in relation to a particular issue, did you weigh up the options or jump to conclusions? What range of options did you consider? What assumptions did you make about each of those options? Were they probabilized? And were there any asymptotes involved? Okay. Any final thoughts or comments before we finish? No? Okay. Well, thanks for that then. I will now stop the recording.